how can we, according to Foucault, how is it possible to go beyond biopolitics, which also means now you understand to go beyond sovereignty. You remember the first quote, which is not on the handout, that I'll just read it once again. What we need is a political philosophy that isn't erected around the problem of sovereignty, nor therefore around problems of law and prohibition. We need to cut off the king's head in political theory that has still to be done. So going beyond the problem of sovereignty, which also means, and now you understand, going beyond the problems of law and prohibition, because what we have to understand under these terms is the mechanism of the self-subjugation, that is the way in which the subject interiorizes law and prohibition, that is interiorizes the problem of the norm, and we saw that biology is a very productive, normative, norm-productive discourse. Clearly, Foucault is absolutely convinced, and this will be my conclusion in the last part for today. So, first part was what is the deconstructive power of biopolitics. Second part was no, biopolitics is still a form of sovereignty, and then the conclusion, a critique of Foucault. Foucault is absolutely convinced that the notion of the symbolic has to be deconstructed. Well, deconstruction is not the term he uses, as you know. Let's say critique, talks about critique. And in my lecture, I will talk about this notion of critique in Foucault. What does it mean? So I will say that the symbolic has to be criticized, has to be subjected to critique. And of course, again, to cut off the king's head means to cut off the distinction between the symbolic and the magical. He rejects the symbolic in the two senses of the term that we exposed this morning. First, the linguistic one. That is, as the symbolic as a means of expression, like power speeding through symbols. Remember this morning, blood and so on. So he's criticizing the production of the body as a form of discourse. That is the constitution of the body into a linguistic symbol. So it's very, criticizes this very much, particularly in the history of sexuality. And again, for him, sexuality, as Freud defines it, is just another symbolic constitution, just another way of constituting a bodily part into a symbol. So he both criticizes the symbolic in this sense, but it also criticizes very much the symbolic in the Lévi-Straussian sense. He says this story of the floating signifier, of the void, etc., we don't need that. If we want to deconstruct sovereignty, we have to deconstruct both meanings of the symbolic and the linguistic one, and the anthropological, or let's say social one, or psychic one, the symbolic. And we will see that in also Gambon and Derrida, there's a very strong critique of Lévi-Strauss. Nobody wants to eat the symbolic as Lévi-Strauss defines it. And they all want to get over it and to show that this was still a form of sovereignty that Lévi-Strauss was describing. This notion of the empty signifier, or of the void, or of the void, zero value. It is another form of kingship. And they all, we'll see tomorrow morning that in Agamben has a whole chapter on the sacred. I think it's chapter, I don't remember, 5, sacred body, etc. Where he says, when I, Agamben, talk about the sacred, it is not in the Lévi-Straussian sense. This notion of the symbolic as the empty, the value zeros, no, we don't buy that. We don't want that. We have to go over it. Okay? So Foucault thinks that he's that is proposing a very strong and radical critique of the symbolic and consequently also of sovereignty and consequently also from the distinction between the symbolic and the biological. He thinks now is ready to talk about genuine materiality. Okay? That if we get rid of the classical concept of biopolitics, now we'll be ready to talk about pleasures with an S, as I said, and then about material bodies. Now it's time to talk about bodies. As Butler says, bodies that matter. You understand now this title, bodies that matter, which means bodies that are material and not only symbolic entities. So Foucault is absolutely convinced that, not that he didn't doubt of what he was doing, was somebody really modest, and of course, but I'm sure that he had the idea that he cleared the space, which he did actually, cleared the space for a new concept of the body, which would be genuinely material, and consequently also for a new space for politics that would cease to be the incarnation of the norm. And look what he says. It's on my handout this time. It's the third quote, and it comes also from Truth and Power. But I made a mistake because I told you it was 1977, and on the handout it appears 1976, so there must be a mistake somewhere. Sorry. I will check when this interview was done. Okay, so in this interview, Truth and Power, look at what he says. So he's talking about power. The problem is it wants to distinguish among events, to differentiate the networks and levels to which they belong, and to reconstitute the lines along which they are connected and engender one another. Look, from this follows a refusal of analysis couched in terms of the symbolic field or the domain of signifying structures, and the recourse to analysis in terms of the genealogy of relations of force, strategic developments, and tactics. Here, I believe one's point of reference should not be the great model of language and science, but rather that of war and battle. The history that bears and determines us has the form of a war rather than that of a language, relations of power, not relations of meaning. Okay? So there's a very interesting passage in which Foucault says, as you can see, that we don't have to use this term of the symbolic. The symbolic was useful to describe what sovereignty is and was and still is in biopolitics, but we don't have to refer to that any longer. So we have to find a new language, and this is the challenge. We have to find a new way of speaking, as I said this morning, new concepts to describe what power is without referring to the distinction between the biological and the symbolic. Okay? So let's give up the linguistic field. I'm not describing power in terms of language. No, this is what he says. The point of reference should not be the great model of language and science. So this was for describing sovereignty, but for us now, criticizing sovereignty shouldn't be the point of reference any longer. And let's not have recourse also to the symbolic field, implicitly the Lévi-Straussian thing. Okay? All right? Okay? So let's give up the the symbolic field, and the domain of signifying structures. If you want to really be able to deconstruct, well, to present a new political philosophy, a new theory of power, and that is consequently a critique or a deconstruction of sovereignty, we have to find a new way, a new way of speaking, and we have to create new concepts, which once and for all would be free from this distinction. And it is very clear Foucault has a solution. He says we have to substitute the vocabulary of war for that of language. And let's see things as a genealogy of relations of force. So it supposes, do you understand who Foucault is thinking of at this point? Who is the model for this genealogy, relations of force, war? Pardon? Virigno? Oh my God, he wasn't even born. Well, perhaps he was.
I mean, this is why I was like,
No, he was born, actually, but I don't think. Nietzsche, of course, Nietzsche. Well, Foucault very clearly thinks that Nietzsche is the philosopher who frees us from the old distinction between the symbolic and the logical. So this would be another discussion to know whether Nietzsche is fits within this new frame or is still indebted to the symbolic, etc. But clearly for Foucault, there's another way of speaking, which is genealogy and relation of force of forces and war. Okay, relations of power of war relations, and not relations of meaning. Forces, in the vocabulary of war, being, these little micro powers. We said a moment ago in the first part of the seminar that they were both symbolic and biological, both or neither, one or the other, So when we talk about forces as power relations, we just talk about some, how does Nietzsche call that? Values. We just talk about facts, okay? Facts of domination, both material and symbolic, but without any distinction between them. Just facts of power, facts of domination. Okay? So Foucault thinks, he says, I'm rejecting the symbolic. I don't want to use that term. So when I talk about the body, for example, and the place of the body within politics, I will use the vocabulary of war that is of pure facts. A fact is both material and signifying, but we cannot draw a distinction between the two, okay? But look at the last quote. Why do I say that perhaps Foucault fails at escaping the vocabulary of the symbolic and the biological? I mean, why do I consider that he might be still trapped within that distinction and still, in fact, using the vocabulary of the symbolic? The first time he uses the word biopolitics is in a talk, The Birth of Social Medicine. It's the last quote. It was a lecture that he gave in Brazil. And this is what he said. What I maintain is that with capitalism, we did not go from a collective medicine to a private medicine. Exactly the opposite occurred. Capitalism, which developed from the end of the 18th century to the beginning of the 19th century, started by socializing the first object, the body, as a factor of productive force of labor power. Society's control over individuals was accomplished not only through consciousness or ideology, but also in the body and with the body. For capitalist society, it was biopolitics, the biological, the somatic, the corporeal, that mattered more than anything else. The body is a biopolitical reality. Medicine is a biopolitical strategy. So it seems to be like, well, something which is not really, I would say, you read that, you say, okay, this Foucault thought, conception of biopolitics. He explains that, so sometimes it shifts, sometimes it says biopolitics emerges at the turn of the 17th century, sometimes it says end of the 18th and turn of the 18th century and beginning of 19th century, so it shifts a little bit on dates. But you have this idea that a new form of power emerges in the West with capitalism, that is, you remember, industrial power. And that this new power is a power in the body and with the body, okay? The individual body. It's the same idea that the one we presented a moment ago. Alright? But look, what is, then we'll turn to the notion of the body in Foucault. What is the body within the frame of biopolitics and sovereignty? What is a body? It says it is a living body, remember. It is the living body, the organism. Okay? And he wants to say that biopolitics is investing the biological body, is symbolically investing the biological body. But look, you cannot find a word for that. Right? He says biological body is okay. Several times in the history of sexuality and society must be defended. Here, in interviews, say, yeah, biopolitics works on the biological body. So, Foucault, what is the biological body? Well, let me think of synonyms. And here they come. The biological, the somatic, the corporeal. And so Foucault, what is the biological body? It is the biological. What is the biological, the somatic, and the corporeal? And we will find exactly the three terms in the history of sexuality. What is the biological body? Well, in fact, we don't know. We know if we read other descriptions that it is about, as I said, organism, functions, membrane, tissues. But yes, but we need a philosophical concept of the biological. So what is it, Foucault? Well, what do you mean? Well, I mean something which is not symbolic. So what is it? Well, the somatic. Frankly, I don't know what you think, but who would call the biological body the somatic? Who would ever, what biologist would ever call the organic?
James Lovelock, maybe.
Who's that?
Gaia theory. This guy who talks about
yes.
organism at the level
I
of
see.
terrestrial.
The somatic,
Yeah,
what do you hear in that notion?
the body, soma, the
Is that all?
individual.
No, of course. Of course. So what do you hear? And what? If we talk about Freud.
The unconscious symbolizing itself.
Yeah, of course. The psychic. Okay? So I know that some theories, like the one now I see who you mean, this Geyer theory, and it's true that you have some trends like working on the somatic and as the body. But the very name, the somatic, is not a biological category. It is a category framed by psychoanalysis, doesn't even exist, it's not a concept. Nobody ever talked about the somatic, doesn't exist. It was created by, I don't know if it's by Freud probably. Yes?
If I could just interject a little bit, I see where you're going with that. I think that's really interesting. But just on a little factual side, within genetics we talk about somatic as a cell, as the kind of cells that make up the kind of lump of our body, as distinguished from germline cells, which are the reproductive things that go to next generation.
But of course, yeah, absolutely, and sorry for that, you're quite right, the somatic versus the germinal. Here, Foucault does not refer to that. It doesn't mean the somatic as opposed to the sexual cells. Okay? He means the biological as such, which is what we don't know, which is, let's say, physical material body. But there's a first problem here, is that this notion is not a biological notion outside the meaning you just reminded, which is something else. Nobody would call an organism the somatic, and it was a term which was created by precisely what Foucault is criticizing, that is psychology. Okay? Because it has something like already psychic in it. Psychosomatic. So the somatic cannot work outside of psychic. So the corporeal, which is another invention, like the substantification of an adjective, le corps in French, le corporel, which again doesn't mean anything from a biological point of view. You wouldn't describe a biological body as the corporeal. So if you look closely to the biological, the somatic, the corporeal, it is very close to phenomenological categories, like the flesh, this tendency to transform adjectives into substantives. And of course, as you can see, it does not bring any explanation to the biological. There's just a series of descriptions. So we see what he means, of course. We see that he's looking for a name to designate the material notion of the body, but he fails to talk about the somatic, the corporeal, etc. Is precisely a way of introducing the symbolic within precisely what he wants to do what he wants to avoid. Okay? The body is the political reality. Okay, but this biopolitical reality, properly bio in biopolitics, we still don't know what it is. So we'll find the same problem in the history of sexuality, exactly the same. What is the page?
That you were on earlier?
No, it's a quote from. Yes, it's 142 from the history of sexuality.
Sure.
142. It says, let's start with 141 first. Yeah. It says, I'm really dealing, when I talk about biopolitics, I'm really dealing with the material body. Okay? I'm really dealing with the biological body. Look at the last paragraph in 151. Here, we need to distinguish between two questions. First, does the analysis of sexuality, that is my own discourse, my Foucault, my discourse, Foucault's discourse, does the analysis of sexuality necessarily imply the elision of the body, anatomy, the biological, the functional? To this question, I think we can reply in the negative. In any case, the purpose of the present study is in fact to show how deployments of power are directly connected to the body, to bodies, functions, physiological processes, sensations, and pleasures. Far from, I'll read the whole part, far from the body having to be effaced, what is needed is to make it visible through an analysis in which the biological and the historical are not consecutive to one another, as in the evolutionism of the first sociologists, but are bound together in an increasingly complex fashion in accordance with the development of the modern technologies of power that take life as their objective. Hence, I do not envisage a history of mentalities that would take account of bodies only through the manner in which they have been perceived and given meaning and value, but a history of bodies and the manner in which what is most material and most vital in them has been invested. Very interesting passage. So what are you doing, Foucault? I'm writing this history of sexuality. What does that mean? Do it means that you will talk about the symbolic? No. I won't elude the question of the body, anatomy, the biological, the functional. No, I reply negatively to this question. This is what I take into account in my description of sexuality and biopolitics. Precisely, I take seriously, my analysis is based on the body, the anatomy, the biological, the functional. What is that? Well, I mean, bodies, functions, physiological processes, sensations, and pleasures. So, what else can you say? I say that I'm elaborating a history of bodies, not a history of mind or of mentality. I'm elaborating a history of bodies. That is, the manner, I will describe the manner in which what is most material and most vital in them, bodies, has been invested by power. So very clearly again, he says, I'm not working on the symbolic, I'm working on the bodily. And when I say on the body, I mean the biological. Right? But here again, see the first description. Body is equal to anatomy, is equal to the biological, is equal to the functional. Very vague terms again. Again, what I'm trying to describe is connected to the body, that is, to bodies equal functions, equal physiological processes, equal sensations, equal pleasures. Okay? All that is constitutive of the biological body. But functions, physiological processes, sensations, and pleasures. Here again, very vague, why should biology be concerned with pleasures or sensations? No? And then you have this last part of the paragraph. I'm interested, what I'm trying to do is a history of bodies and the manner in which what is most material and most vital in them has been invested. So it means that if there is something most material and vital in the body, it means that there is something less material and less vital. Okay? So Foucault seems to admit here that in fact there are degrees of bodily reality, going from the most material to the less material. And he says, I'm interested in the most material which implies negatively that there's something less material, okay? And that is not coherent with this discourse, because if you want to write about the materiality of bodies, you have to admit that bodies are only material, that there are only material entities, and that there's nothing in the body which is less material than the most material. And you see that in this CGM between the most and the less, the more or less material is absolutely, well, you can hear it in the floating list: bodies, functions, physiological processes, sensations, pleasure, the biological, the anatomy, the functional. Okay. So I'm really interested in that attempt at pinpointing what the materiality of the biological body is, and this impossibility. This impossibility in which philosophy is to really touch what it wants to touch when it comes to materiality. This impossibility in which we are, and perhaps in which I'm also, okay? Because I don't accept. We want to describe materiality, but we fail because we admit, without perhaps noticing, of course, but without being honest, we admit that there's something less material that is symbolic. So that's why you can read, I think, the whole of Foucault's work. You'll find absolutely fascinating descriptions of biology as a science and of what biology does, but you won't ever find a sufficient description of the biological body, ever. It will always be that kind, like somatic, corporeal, pleasures, sensations, like, like a proliferation of concepts with which, you see what I mean, which let the essential escape. We still don't know what the biological is in the end. Well, we only know that it's the living body. But what is it? Okay, that's why we'll see tomorrow that Hegel is quite aware of that and says, okay, so we have to specify what we're talking about when we talk about the living bodies. We're talking about Zoe. You know this notion, Zoe. I'll explain that tomorrow morning. Or if you want, we have to talk about bare life. The biological is what is bare. Like life, naked life. Raw, I don't know, raw material of life. Okay? And it is true that Hegel is quite aware of that lack in Foucault. He says Foucault doesn't go far enough in the definition of, his genius has to, he discovered biopolitics, and this is absolutely fundamental, and in this new structure of power we have the living body, but Foucault does not go far enough in the definition of what the living body is. So we have to find new concepts. So we'll call bios the symbolic body, and Zoe, or bare life, the biological body. And we'll see how they can be one and the same, if they can be confused or not. Okay? But we need two names. Otherwise, we will have a list, just like in Foucault. We'll speak of, the corporeal, the somatic. So let's have one name for that. One name only. Yeah. Yes?
I'm wondering, is there I'm just thinking about the words and how you're going through what is the body and really trying to deconstruct that and pull out the fact that we can't pull it out. Where does doing that same thing to just, you also mentioned, and he mentions, of course, the living body. So doing that same thing to life, like where,
of course,
coming to just life, maybe
to just life
body is not the most important term, or I don't know, can you get at it in a different way through life? I think maybe sciences are trying to do that. But.
No, you're right. Behind all that, behind these analysis of the body. Of course, the main concept is life. And I'm sure that, the three of them would say there's only one life, and not two. There's no, on the one hand, the bodily life, biological life, and on the other, the symbolic life. There's only one life. And if Agamben distinguishes between political life and bare life or biological life, it's to paradoxically show the unity of the two, that they form one and the same essence. What is characteristics of our time is that we cannot distinguish any longer between bare life and political life. That in fact our biological life is also our political life. But it doesn't work either. So we'll see that, I tried to make the same critique of bare life, which is that bare life is still another name for the symbolic. So I'm preparing what I'll do tomorrow. It's on page 140 on Homo sacer. And of course I will describe this tomorrow, or analyze this tomorrow. Bare life, the government says, it's 140, bare life is no longer confined to a particular place or a definite category. It now dwells in the biological body of every living being. So, come on. You said that the biological body was bare life. Okay? There was another name for the biological. And now you say bare life is situated, dwells in the biological body of every living being. It means that there are two separate things. And yes, there are two separate things. We'll see tomorrow that in fact there is always something else within the biological than the biological. Okay? Even when they want to touch it, even when they want to name it, like I'm talking about the material body, I'm talking about the empirical body, I'm talking about the biological body. There's always a moment when something reappears, which is the cut between the biological and something else. And here it is very clear. It dwells in the biological body. So it is something like the biological body in the biological body. So it's not the biological body then. It is something different from it.
Which page is that, sir?
140. 140, sorry. Okay, so we'll talk about that tomorrow more in details. But it is, I said, we want to abolish all the distinctions between the symbolic and the material. We want to talk about the material body, but each time they try, you find this little crack in the discourse. Bare life is somewhere in your biological body. So if it is somewhere in my biological body, it means that it's only a part of it or something different from it. And that's and then the biological is still something else. Okay? And the third philosopher Derrida, when we read The Beast and the Sovereign, so in 2 days, says, no, if we want to talk about the biological body, we have to cease speaking of the human body. Okay, let's be serious. If we want to talk about the material body, it has to be the animal body. So the animal will be my subject, Derrida says. After all, animality is the best name for the biological. I don't believe in their life, symbolic life, and all that. I don't believe in Agamben's distinction. I don't believe in Foucault analysis of the living being. If we want to deconstruct sovereignty, and if you want to talk about the materiality, there's only one thing which we have to do, is to cease to value the distinction between the human and the animal. So let's talk about animality. Alright? Says, and this is true, Derrida is quite right on that point. It's very surprising that neither Foucault or Gambin talk about the animal, which is surprising when it comes to biopolitics, okay? And the biological. Strange. The word animal doesn't appear once. And it is true that when Agamben talks about zoe, he never evokes zoology. No. Zoe, pure zoe, human zoe. But, so there it says, no. If we want to deconstruct all that, then let's talk about what philosophy has always contempted or dismissed, that is the animal. Okay. So, you read The Beast and the Sovereign and try to find a satisfactory definition of the animal and what appears in the end. But Derrida, what is the best definition of an animal, according to you, Derrida? He has this answer, a poem. You know, this, he plays with words. In French, so the plural of animals is animaux. Okay? And you write it like that. Animaux. Any word. Okay? I don't know if you can understand that in English, but anyway. It says, the true concept of animality is a poetic concept of animality. That is, it is always the same story. That is, biology as a science is what prevents us from understanding what the material body is. You know, it is there. But we cannot ask biology to provide us with a satisfactory concept of the biological body, because biology is what, in a way, dismisses the material body itself, because it's too normative. Okay? So biology is a discourse of the norm and not a discourse of the material as such. Okay? So we have to ask philosophy itself to provide us with a satisfactory concept of the material. This is bare life for Agamben. Or we have to ask poetry, okay, or art, to provide us with the satisfactory of the material. And for Derrida, it's poetry. So what is an animal? It's a poem. Why? Because a poem, and this, of course, I will explain all that. A poem is what escapes, poetry is what escapes sovereignty. If something can escape sovereignty, it is poetry. So, you see now the general direction of the discourse I will develop in tomorrow and after tomorrow, is that at the very moment when philosophy wants to deconstruct the distinction between the symbolic and the biological, at the very moment when we're getting close, very close to something like a new discourse on materiality and material body, when we're very close to deconstruction of phenomenology and the flesh that we were talking about this morning, when we want to really deal with life and not with existence, because you're right, it is life which is the main concept. They want to cease speaking about existence and really take life into account as a political and philosophical reality. At this very moment, something happens. It is as if something like a line of division, something like, you know, the old thing, the old symbolic thing was still working. Still, you see what I mean? And in fact, the animal OT or bare life, or even the biological in Foucault defined as somatic or corporeal, it functions as this value zero, as this symbolic entity Lévi-Strauss is talking about. We cannot go beyond. It is as if we remain trapped within that. Okay? So, is it possible to affirm that there's only one life and not two? Is it possible to build a new elaboration of life in which definitely the notions of existence, symbolic bodies, flesh, would disappear? I mean, would once and for all be superseded? Would that be possible? And would that be a genuine deconstruction of sovereignty? This is my question. And is it possible? And we also, I have that on my sheet, you know, in Faith and Knowledge, and we'll also deal with that in 2 days. Derrida says, I quote, life has absolute value only if it is worth more than life. Okay? More than life. Life has absolute value only if it is worth more than life. And a bit further in the text, he explains what he means by more than life. He says, more than the natural and biozoological. So, he clearly says that there's something more in life than biological life. What is this more? You know, and here again we find the more or less thing, more most material, less symbolic, or more symbolic, less. You find this degree, these degrees in reality of life. So my question is, can we overcome such? Or is it constitutive of continental philosophy? For me, this is a real problem. Okay? If we erase that distinction, if we really can go beyond it, then what is continental philosophy?
Well, what happens to communication and ethics if we get rid of the questions why and how?
Yeah.
And which is the question, how are we going to do this and why? Right?
Of course, if you read Levinas, for example, because you're talking about ethics, and that's why immediately, he's the philosopher, I'm immediately thinking about, of course, for him, when he talks about the face of the other, doesn't have any material meaning. Ethics is all about the symbolic dimension of life. And if we talk about ethics of animality, etc., it is from this symbolic point of view. Ethics for Levinas is the irreducible part of the symbolic within the material. Okay? So yes, you're quite right. What is continental ethics if we erase the border between the biological and the symbolic? What does remain from the continental tradition if we touch that frontier? Because we have other forms of ethics in analytic philosophy. Okay?
My other question is about communication. I'm just having trouble understanding how you can see about communication and understanding without symbols.
But it's all about some. So yes, I understand what you mean. I'm not saying that the symbolic does not exist. Okay. Of course, we need symbols and signs to communicate. I say that there is no distinction between the symbolic and the biological, which is not the same thing. Okay? That the symbolic is rooted. Somebody said that it's rooted within materiality. Okay? So of course we need signs and symbols, but they are not secluded from the biological.
Which would mean that everyone within would have to speak the same language.
No. This is precisely the false vision.
Well, it's a question.
Yeah, I know. Of course. This is the traditional vision, continental vision of biology. If you say that the material, the symbolic is rooted within the material, then it is like no differences. Everybody will speak the same language. We'll all become machines. But no. Okay? So I'll talk. Well, you know, I'm very interested in neurobiology. What they say, the neurobiologists, is that human diversity is rooted in this material determination. You know, so no, doesn't have to be like everybody talking the same language, saying the same thing. No.
If I could rephrase your question to try to understand, I'm curious if you would agree with this and might help shed some light on that question. That a kind of caveat to your question maybe, is it possible to efface this distinction between the biological and the symbolic without resorting, in continental philosophy's parlance, without resorting to a kind of holist ontology, or a kind of flat ontology within which, you know, maybe something like a conatus is the only kind of conceivable source of change that you arrive at, but through which one can't really adequately conceive of change at all, or you can't really understand why anything would change if conatus is posited as kind of engine for causality, if you do that a little more detailedly. But there's the danger with that incompatible parlance is, you know, how to avoid, ask this question and resist a kind of flat ontology, or like you're saying, a conception of communication that is maybe like unitonal.
But I'm not at all an analytic philosopher, okay? Not at all. But if I were one, I would say, show me that the continental ontology is not a flat one, okay? That talking about the distinction between existence and life, between essence or ethics and material, show me that it isn't flat. That it doesn't produce one discourse, like everybody saying the same thing, using the same words, and that it's taken for granted that there's something transcendental which is irreducible to the empirical, and this is flat. Show me that this is not. Okay. I don't see why continental philosophy should be more, I don't know, considered as something not flat, right? So,
I'm open to responses that aren't a pure critique, also.
that are?
They're like, I was asking about how this,
Yes, I know, but I can't give you like one sentence answer, you understand? Because it's a very big question, all right? It's not like, oh, okay, this is this. It is central, it is something really difficult. First of all, and this is why I insist, because I want to answer your question by a question, with a question, which is, first of all, which is, perhaps this will, if we are able to produce one day a kind of continental discourse on one life, on the end of the distinction between the symbolic and the logical, if we succeed in talking about materiality, and this is something Marx has already said, then philosophy will disappear, right? Continental philosophy will disappear. And this is something which Marx announced, that true materialism is the end of the continental, European, what he called European philosophy. It is the end. Okay? Because continental philosophy, it is not because everybody will speak the same language. It's not because of that. It is because continental philosophy is absolutely rooted in the distinction between body and soul. And that even deconstruction still believes in the transcendental is something which is irreducible to the material. Okay? Like poetry, for example, like whatever you want to call it, like ethics. And Levinas is very clear on that. My face is not, le visage n'est pas la figure. The face is not the material materiality of the face. This dimension is the transcendence, is something, as we said this morning, which takes us away from ourselves, which makes us be always outside of ourselves. And continental philosophy is all about that, the transcendental, the possibility of going beyond the beyond structure is the structure of philosophy.
Which I think the way the 2 points converge, I don't want to take over this discussion, so...
No, but I'm not only talking to you, I'm talking to...
No, but I'm talking a lot. So
You remember the beginning of totality and infinity. Levinas says metaphysics is all about the possibility of going out, transcending.
Well,
You remember the first ones of totality and infinity. So if we cannot go beyond, what does philosophy become?
Well, I don't think we should reduce continental philosophy to Levinas. For example, I think that poetry can be, language can be considered something very material.
This is a general structure. This
Right.
transcendent structure is common to all continental
But
philosophers.
it doesn't go for Deleuze, for instance, who is the philosopher of immanence.
Yeah. Well, I have in desert island, you know this text by Deleuze. How do we recognize structuralism? À quoi reconnaît-on le structuralisme? And he says that Foucault is the greatest of all structuralist philosophers because he believes in the symbol and that we have to. So what do you do with, we'll have to study the text of course, but what do you do with the body without organs? What do you do with the necessity of the value zero, of the empty signifier, of these zero values around, which are central motives in Deleuze? What do you do with such an immanentism, which is so open to transcendence and indifference? Difference. There are a notion of difference. Okay? So, is it the end of continental philosophy, or is it a new opening for continental philosophy? Okay? Can we think beyond? It's another kind of beyond this distinction between the material and the symbolic. Okay? And produce a discourse which is not reducible to the cognitivist discourse, to the neurobiological discourse, which is something different. Okay, which is still continental, like European, rooted in European philosophy, and at the same time different from European philosophy. Well, I don't know. I mean, but for sure, I mean that these notions, well, when they try to define the biological bodies with, corporeals, the somatic, there's something wrong in that, for sure. It's absolutely true. Well, okay, so tomorrow, again, Ben, do you have the book? Because, well,